we never forget our boy.
I want to start this story with something uncomfortable, because this is not just a story about a crime. This is a story about a child who became a killer. And the question that stays with me is not only what happened, but how something like this becomes possible at all. In the summer of 1993, in a small, quiet town called Savannah, New York, life was simple. It was the kind of place where people knew each other, where kids played outside, where parents believed their children were safe just a block away from home. That morning, a little boy named Derrick Roby was getting ready to go to the park. He was 4 years old, almost 5, full of energy, full of life, the kind of kid people later described as a little firecracker. His father coached his t-ball team. He loved being outside. He loved running, playing, just being a kid. That morning, something small changed. Derrick's baby brother was crying. His mum was distracted. And for the first time, Derrick asked if he could go to the park alone. It was only 1 block, no streets to cross, a straight path, something that probably felt completely safe. And this is one of those moments where, looking back, everything feels different. Because at the time, it didn't seem like a dangerous decision. It seemed like a normal one. But sometimes, it's exactly these normal moments that turn into something irreversible. Derrick kissed his mum goodbye. She told him she loved him. He said, "I love you too." And he walked away. He never made it to the park. Hours later, after panic had already started building, after calls and searching and that growing feeling that something was wrong, his body was found, just a short distance away, in a small wooded area, so close to home, and yet completely out of reach. What happened there was not just a killing. It was something much darker. Derrick had been strangled, then beaten with rocks. But it didn't stop there. His body had been violated, manipulated, almost arranged. And one detail that I personally cannot ignore: the killer didn't stop after the child was already gone. He continued. That tells you something. Not about anger alone, but about something deeper. At first, everyone believed this had to be an adult, some outsider, some unknown danger that had entered this quiet town. Because it's easier to believe that. It's easier to believe that evil comes from outside. But in this case, it didn't. It came from another child, a 13-year-old boy named Eric Smith. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated, because now we are not talking about a grown man. We are talking about a teenager, a boy, someone who, by definition, is still developing, still forming, still learning how to deal with emotions. Eric was known in the town. He had bright red hair, freckles, and he was bullied for it, relentlessly. At school, he was isolated, mocked, ignored. He spent long hours alone, riding his bike around town, trying to be seen, trying to belong. And this is where I think it becomes very important not to look at this story in a one-sided way. Because yes, what he did was horrific. There is no excuse for that. But at the same time, I don't believe that a person is simply born a monster. I think people are shaped by family, by environment, by what happens to them over time. And in Eric's case, it seems like a lot of things were going wrong long before that day. When he later tried to explain why he did it, his answer was almost empty. I don't know. I just saw him, and I wanted to hurt him. That sentence is terrifying in its simplicity, because it suggests that the victim wasn't personal. It wasn't about Derrick. It could have been any child, anyone weaker, anyone more vulnerable. This was not targeted hatred. This was displaced rage. And then comes the part that, for me, is the hardest to process. When investigators asked him what he felt during the act, he said he enjoyed it. Not after, not looking back, in the moment. He enjoyed it. That changes everything, because now we are no longer talking about just losing control. We are talking about experiencing power and liking it. Eric was arrested. He confessed. And because of the severity of the crime, he was tried as an adult, which is extremely rare. But in this case, it reflected the reality of what he had done. He was sentenced to 9 years to life. And at that moment, it probably felt like justice had been served. But the truth is, for the family of Derrick, it was only the beginning. Because every 2 years they had to go through it all again. Every parole hearing, every statement, every memory, relived. Over and over. And I think this is something that people don't always understand. The sentence doesn't end with the trial. For the family, it becomes something permanent, something they carry for life. Now, when it comes to Eric himself, I can't look at him only as evil, because I do see a broken child in that story. A child who didn't know what to do with his emotions. A child who was hurt, humiliated and angry, and who chose the worst possible way to release that anger. That doesn't justify anything. But it explains something, and I think that matters. Because if we say he was just a monster, we stop asking deeper questions. And this is where I personally believe responsibility spreads wider. Yes, he committed the act. But where were the adults? Where were the teachers? Where was the system that allowed a child to be bullied to the point where he starts saying, "I feel like I want to hurt someone"? Because that didn't start on the day of the murder. That started long before. At the same time, I also have to say this clearly. Understanding is not the same as opravdanie, because what he did was brutal, and he deserved punishment for it. But then the story doesn't end there, because years pass, and Eric grows up in prison, not outside, not in normal life. He becomes an adult inside a system. He goes through therapy, programs, reflection. And eventually the question appears, not what did he do, but who is he now? And this is where everything becomes uncomfortable again, because there is no clear answer. And I think that's what makes this case so difficult. As the years passed, Eric Smith was no longer that 13-year-old boy. He became an adult. And with that came a new kind of question. Not about guilt, but about change. Every 2 years he stood in front of a parole board. And every 2 years, the same story repeated itself. The same crime, the same details, the same pain for the Roby family, over and over again. And this is something that, honestly, I find very difficult to process. Because on one hand, this is how the system works. There are laws, there are procedures, there are rules that apply even to the most horrific cases. But on the other hand, it feels like the system forces the victim's family to relive the worst day of their lives again and again. And that, to me, feels incredibly heavy. At those hearings, Eric began to speak more, to reflect, to explain.
My actions have caused a terrible loss in the Roby family, and for that I'm truly sorry.
He talked about being bullied, about feeling powerless, about wanting, for once, not to be the one who is hurt, but the one who hurts. And again, this is where the story becomes very complicated, because part of what he says makes sense. Not in a way that opravdivate what he did, but in a way that explains the emotional mechanism behind it. He wasn't targeting Derrick personally. He was reacting to a world where he felt small, humiliated, and constantly attacked. And he chose someone weaker. That is a pattern we see again and again in violence. But then we return to that same disturbing detail. He said he enjoyed it. And that makes it impossible to look at this case as only a loss of control. There was awareness. There was experience. There was something that went beyond just anger. Over time, experts began to evaluate him. Psychologists, risk assessment specialists, people whose job is to answer a very difficult question. Is this person still dangerous? And the truth is, even they don't have a clear answer. One psychologist said something that I think is extremely important. There is no test, no method, no guaranteed way to determine whether someone has truly changed. You can observe behavior, You can analyze patterns. You can listen to what they say, but you cannot look inside a person and be 100% sure. And this is exactly where my own position becomes very divided. Because if I look at this situation from one side, I think he took a life, a child's life. He caused unimaginable suffering. And for that alone, part of me feels like he should never be free. But then I look from another side. He was also a child, 13 years old, not fully formed, not fully developed. And everything that shaped him, the bullying, the emotional instability, the environment, all of that happened before he ever made that choice. And then he spent almost 3 decades in prison, growing up, changing, becoming someone else, or at least trying to. So when the parole board finally made their decision in 2021, it wasn't simple. After 11 hearings, after years of denial, they granted him parole.
Derrick Smith, who's been behind bars for nearly 3 decades, is no longer in prison.
And in 2022, after 28 years in prison, Derrick Smith was released, a free man. And this is where the real question begins. Not what happened in 1993, but what do we do with someone like this now? Because I can't give a simple answer. I can't say, yes, he should be free. And I can't say, no, he should stay in prison forever. For me, it's both. At the same time, I can accept the idea that a person might change, especially someone who was a child when they committed the crime. I can accept that years of therapy, isolation, and reflection might reshape someone. But at the same time, I cannot ignore something very important. There are no guarantees. None. Not a single psychologist. Not the best expert in the world. Not any system. No one can say, with certainty, this person will never do something like this again. And that, to me, is the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. Which is why I keep coming back to one thought. If society decides to give someone like this a second chance, then society also has a responsibility, because releasing someone and simply hoping for the best is not enough, especially in cases like this. There should be monitoring, long-term, structured, gradual. Not just, you are free now, go live your life, but something that reflects the reality of what happened. Because this is not a minor offense. This is not a mistake that affected only one moment. This is something that changed multiple lives forever. And at the same time, I think about Derrick, a child who never had the chance to grow up, never had the chance to become anything more than those 4 years and 10 months. And I think about his parents, who had to live not only with loss, but with the system bringing that loss back to them every 2 years. And still, they stayed together. They supported each other. They chose to continue living. And I have a lot of respect for that, so where does that leave us? For me, it leaves me in a place where 2 truths exist at the same time. Derrick Smith committed a horrific crime, and he deserved punishment. But Derrick Smith was also a broken child, and I cannot ignore that either. And maybe the hardest part of this story is accepting that both of those things can be true at the same time, without cancelling each other out. Because sometimes the most difficult cases are not the ones where we don't know the truth, but the ones where we do and still don't know what to do with it. I want to start this story with a question that has been bothering me for a long time. Not a legal question, not even really a criminal question, a human one. What actually happens inside a person's mind at the moment a crime is committed? What happens in the seconds before someone crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed? Is it rage, desperation, fear, relief, or is it something stranger? Something half-conscious, something that even the person themselves might not fully understand. That question is the reason I started looking into this case. But the strange thing is, the deeper I went into it, the less clear the answer became. Because this story, the death of Amy Fanion, doesn't resolve that question. If anything, it makes it more complicated. And even now, after watching the interviews, reading the testimony, and looking at the evidence presented in court, I'm left with the same uneasy feeling. I can't say with absolute certainty what really happened inside that house. What I can do is walk you through the story, step by step, and explain why this case continues to divide people even after the verdict.
Hi, this is Brian Fanion. I'm at North Road. My wife just shot herself.
The story begins on May 8th, 2018. It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Westfield, Massachusetts. A typical New England town where people know their neighbors, where church and community events matter, and where reputations can follow families for generations. Inside a farmhouse on North Road, 51-year-old Amy Fanion was preparing lunch. Her husband, Brian Fanion, had just arrived home from work. Brian wasn't just any husband. He was a detective with the Westfield Police Department. In the community, he was known as a respected officer, a church deacon, a volunteer on missionary trips. For many people in town, the Fanions seemed like the ideal couple. They had been together since they were teenagers. Amy was 16 when she met Brian, who was 19 at the time. They married in 1985. More than 30 years of marriage followed. They raised 2 children. They were active in church. They traveled on mission trips. They volunteered in their community. To outsiders, their life looked stable, faithful, and deeply rooted. But behind that appearance, like in many long marriages, there were tensions. And on that afternoon in May, something happened that would completely destroy the image of that family. At around 1 p.m., Brian Fanion called 911. His voice sounded panicked. He told the dispatcher something shocking. His wife had just shot herself. Emergency responders and police rushed to the house. When investigators entered the dining room, they found Amy lying on the floor. She had been shot once in the head. There was blood on the floor beneath her body. Nearby, investigators found a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol, Brian's own service weapon. The room looked strangely ordinary for such a violent moment. On the dining table sat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on a plate. Another plate nearby had a smear of blood. Chairs were slightly pushed out. Papers and a police radio were nearby. It looked like a normal lunch scene interrupted by tragedy. According to Brian, that's exactly what had happened. He told investigators he had come home for lunch. Amy was making sandwiches. But when he arrived, an argument resumed, one that had started the night before. The argument, Brian said, was about retirement. After decades on the police force, he was planning to retire soon. Amy wanted to stay in their historic 200-year-old house. Brian wanted something different. He wanted to travel more. He didn't want to spend his retirement maintaining an old property. They argued about their future. They argued about responsibilities. They even argued about their aging dog and whether they should get another one. Normal marital disagreements. Nothing that seemed remotely connected to what would happen next. Brian said that at some point during the argument, he placed his gun on a cabinet in the dining room before stepping into the bathroom. When he came out, Amy was holding the gun. According to Brian, she raised the gun to the side of her head. He remembered her saying something like, "I guess you don't want me around." Brian said he was only a few feet away. He tried to reach her, but before he could stop her, the gun fired. Amy collapsed. Brian said he rushed to her side, held her hand, and then called 911. If that version of events were true, the case would have been tragic but simple. A sudden emotional breakdown, a terrible impulsive decision. But almost immediately, detectives began noticing details that didn't fit that explanation. One investigator later said something important. The moment he saw the wound, he had a feeling something wasn't right. And eventually, the forensic report supported that instinct. Normally, when someone shoots themselves at close range, certain forensic markers appear. Gunshot residue, microscopic particles from the gunpowder, usually land around the wound. There is also a pattern called stippling caused by those particles striking the skin. But in Amy's case, those markers were missing. Ballistic analysis suggested the shot may have been fired from a distance of about 18 inches or more. And that detail changed everything. Because if the gun was not directly against her head, the possibility of suicide suddenly became much less certain. At the same time, investigators uncovered another part of Brian's life that raised serious questions. Brian had been communicating with another woman. Her name was Corey. They had met months earlier during a church mission trip to Mexico. What started as friendship gradually became something more emotional. Investigators later recovered hundreds of deleted text messages between them. Some of those messages sounded unmistakably romantic. On the night before Amy died, Brian texted Corey, "Good night, my love. I hope you have wonderful dreams of the amazing days and nights ahead." She responded, "I will dream of you and all the future holds for us." The next morning, just hours before Amy's death, the two exchanged more messages. Corey asked when she could hold him again. Brian replied, "Not soon enough." Within hours of that message, Amy was dead. And naturally, investigators began asking a difficult question. Was this still a suicide, or something else entirely? Because affairs are one of the most common motives investigators see in domestic homicide cases. A person wants a new life, a new partner, and sometimes a spouse becomes the obstacle. But motive alone is not proof. Many people have affairs. Very few murder their spouses. Still, detectives kept digging, and what they found next made the situation even more disturbing. Search history. Forensic analysts examining Brian's computers found internet searches about poisons, carbon monoxide deaths, and gunshot residue. One search involved watching a video explaining how gunshot residue tests work. Another involved looking at lists of deadly substances. To prosecutors, those searches looked like preparation. To the defense, they were meaningless curiosity. And this is exactly where the case begins to split into two completely different interpretations. One interpretation paints a picture of planning. A man unhappy in his marriage, a new romantic partner, internet searches about death and forensic evidence, a convenient moment alone in the house. But the other interpretation sees something very different. A long marriage under stress, an argument, an impulsive emotional reaction, and a tragic accident or suicide that investigators later misunderstood. The deeper you look at this case, the more it begins to feel like two stories happening at the same time. And depending on which evidence you focus on, either story can start to look believable. That's what makes this case so unsettling, because even the people closest to Amy were divided about what really happened. Many members of Amy's own family believed Brian was innocent. They signed a letter stating they believed Amy had taken her own life. Think about that for a moment. It is extremely rare for the victim's family to defend the accused. But Brian had been part of that family for over 30 years. He wasn't an outsider. He was a son-in-law, a father, someone who had shared decades of life with them. And psychologically, accepting that a loved one committed suicide can sometimes feel less unbearable than believing someone you trusted committed murder. But not everyone agreed. Amy's sister Anna testified in court for the prosecution. She told the jury that Brian once admitted searching online for information about how to make a murder look like a suicide. Whether that search actually existed in the computer records became another point of debate during the trial. And by the time the case finally reached a courtroom years later, the central question remained the same. Did Amy Fanion take her own life, or did the man she had spent 30 years with pull the trigger? By the time the case finally reached trial, nearly 5 years had passed since Amy Fanion's death. And during those years, the investigation had slowly built a picture, one that prosecutors believed pointed clearly toward murder. But even then, the case remained far from simple, because every piece of evidence seemed to come with a counter-argument. And that is exactly what made this trial so unusual. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. They believed Brian Fanion had reached a turning point in his life. After decades of marriage, he had fallen in love with someone else. Corey represented a new beginning. But Amy, his wife of more than 30 years, was still there. And according to prosecutors, divorce was not something Brian wanted, not because it was impossible, but because of what it would mean. Brian was not just a husband, he was a police detective, a church deacon, a respected figure in a small, tightly connected community. Divorce would have been public, messy, embarrassing, and the prosecution argued that Brian feared the damage it would cause to his reputation. So instead they said he chose another way out. Their theory was that during the argument that afternoon, Brian shot Amy and then tried to make the scene look like a suicide. To them, the evidence lined up. The affair, the internet searches, the inconsistencies in his statements, and the forensic evidence suggesting the gun had been fired from a distance, but the defense saw the same facts very differently. Brian's attorneys argued that the prosecution was trying to turn ordinary details into sinister ones. Yes, Brian had been having an emotional relationship with Corey, but emotional affairs, they argued, happen in thousands of struggling marriages. That does not make someone a murderer. And those internet searches? The defense suggested they could easily have innocent explanations. Some of the searches involved household dangers, poisons, and carbon monoxide. Brian lived in an old farmhouse with a wood-burning stove. At the time, a young relative was staying in the home. The defense suggested he may simply have been researching safety risks. And the search about gunshot residue? Brian was a police detective. Understanding forensic evidence could easily fall within professional curiosity. But the defense's most important challenge focused on the forensic evidence itself, because the prosecution's case relied heavily on one idea, that the absence of gunshot residue around Amy's wound meant the gun had been fired from a distance. But the defense presented an expert who offered a completely different explanation. He argued that Amy's thick hair could have blocked the gunshot residue from reaching the skin. Hair, he explained, can act like a filter. Particles that would normally land on the skin can instead become trapped in the hair. To demonstrate this theory, the expert conducted experiments firing a gun through hair placed over ballistic material. The results showed a striking difference. With hair in the way, far fewer particles reached the surface beneath. Without hair, the residue pattern was obvious. In other words, the absence of residue on Amy's skin did not necessarily prove the gun had been fired from far away. And suddenly, the prosecution's strongest forensic argument looked less certain. But there were still the internet searches. Those searches were difficult for the defense to explain, because even if they had innocent explanations individually, taken together they painted an uncomfortable picture. Searches about poisons, searches about deadly substances, a video explaining gunshot residue testing. And all of those searches appeared after Brian had begun communicating with Corey. To many observers, the timing felt suspicious, but suspicion is not the same as proof. And this is exactly where my own thoughts about this case became conflicted, because when I look at Brian Fanion, I cannot say he feels completely innocent. Watching his interviews, I get a strong impression of someone who is extremely controlled, very careful with his words, very aware of how he presents himself. Of course, that may not be surprising. He was a police detective, someone trained to remain calm during stressful situations, someone used to interrogations and investigations. But there is another detail that still bothers me. Brian initially told investigators that his relationship with Corey was only a friendship. Later, the text messages showed something much more intimate. That means he had already lied once. And when someone lies about one important thing in an investigation, it becomes harder to trust the rest of their story. At the same time, I also cannot ignore something else about this case. Amy's own family largely supported Brian, her mother, her siblings, even her children. Most of them believed Amy may have taken her own life. And that is an incredibly unusual situation. Usually, in murder trials, the victim's family demands justice. Here, many of them defended the accused. But when you think about it, there may be understandable reasons. Brian had been part of their family for more than 3 decades. He had raised children with Amy. He had shared holidays, milestones, and memories with them. Accepting that someone so deeply integrated into the family could suddenly commit murder might have been emotionally unbearable. And sometimes people choose the explanation that hurts the least. Another question that often comes up in this case is about the scene itself. Why did it happen during such an ordinary moment? Lunch? Sandwiches on the table? A conversation about retirement? But the more I think about it, the less that detail seems to prove anything. Because depending on how you look at the story, that moment can be interpreted in completely different ways. If Amy shot herself, the scene makes sense. Arguments escalate. Emotions rise. Impulsive actions happen in everyday moments. But if Brian shot her, the scene can also make sense. An argument gets out of control. A moment of anger, or even a deliberate attempt to stage something that would look like a spontaneous suicide. So the sandwiches on the table, the quiet domestic setting, do not really answer the central question. They only make the situation feel more tragic. After weeks of testimony, the trial finally reached its final stage. Closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution repeated their theory. Brian Fanion had deliberately murdered his wife to start a new life. The defense repeated theirs. Amy acted impulsively and tragically took her own life. Then, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. 2 days later, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. Brian Fanion was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some people in the courtroom cried, but not everyone was reacting the same way. Some were grieving Amy. Others were grieving the man they believed had just been wrongly convicted. And that is where this story leaves me. Because even after everything we know, this case still lives in a grey area. There are things that make Brian look suspicious. The affair, the internet searches, the lie about the nature of his relationship. But there are also things that leave room for doubt. The conflicting forensic interpretations, the support from Amy's own family, and the fact that there was no eyewitness, no confession, and no definitive piece of evidence proving exactly what happened in that room. If someone asked me today whether Brian Fanion could have committed this crime, my honest answer would be yes. I believe he was capable of it, but if someone asked me whether the evidence removes all doubt, I'm not sure I could say that either. And that is why this case continues to stay with people long after the verdict. Because sometimes the truth is not clear. Sometimes it hides somewhere between suspicion and certainty. And sometimes, even after a jury has spoken, the question that started everything still remains. What really happened in that room? How far can cruelty go inside a person who is perfectly sane? Because when we talk about horrific crimes, people often try to comfort themselves with one simple explanation. The killer must have been insane, but sometimes that explanation does not exist. Sometimes the person understands exactly what they are doing, and that is what makes this story so disturbing. This is the case of Janna Cassian, a young woman who came to Los Angeles chasing a dream, only to become the victim of one of the most brutal murders detectives in that city had ever seen. And the man responsible for her death was not a stranger. It was the man who claimed to love her. Los Angeles is a city built on dreams. People come here from all over the world. Actors, writers, filmmakers, entrepreneurs, all hoping to build a new life. Janna Cassian was one of those people. She was born and raised in Kyiv, Ukraine. Friends and family described her as curious, adventurous, and optimistic. She was highly educated, working as a tax lawyer before eventually deciding to move to the United States. Her dream was simple. She wanted a family. She wanted a child. And she believed that Los Angeles might be the place where her future would begin. For a while, it seemed that dream was coming true. Because in Los Angeles, she met a man named Blake Liebel. At first glance, Blake looked like the perfect partner. He was wealthy, extremely wealthy. His family in Toronto had made millions in real estate and manufacturing. His grandfather had founded a plastics empire, and his father was a major developer. Blake himself had inherited millions. But instead of continuing the family business, he wanted something different: Hollywood. He dreamed of writing, directing, and producing films. He worked on low-budget movies, graphic novels, and animated projects, hoping to eventually build a name for himself in the entertainment industry. People who met him often described him as friendly, somewhat eccentric, and deeply passionate about his creative ideas. But Blake's life was more complicated than it appeared. He grew up in a family filled with wealth, but also tension. His parents eventually separated. His older brother Cody went to live with their father in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Toronto. Blake stayed with his mother. Some people who knew the family later said Blake felt overshadowed by his brother. Cody was the confident one, the flashy one. He drove rare Ferraris, lived in multi-million-dollar homes, and moved easily through elite social circles. Blake, by contrast, was often described as more withdrawn. He spent long hours working on comics and creative projects. The relationship between the brothers was complicated, sometimes close, sometimes tense, and the relationship between Blake and his father was even more strained. But despite those family dynamics, Blake still lived a life that most people would consider extraordinary. He had money. He had connections. He had the freedom to pursue whatever dream he wanted. And for a long time, that dream was Hollywood. Years before Janna entered his life, Blake had already been married. His wife was Amanda Braun, a model. Together they had a son. By most accounts, their relationship looked stable from the outside. But in the summer of 2015, everything changed. Amanda was pregnant with their second child, and suddenly Blake left. He left the house, he left the marriage, and he began a relationship with another woman. That woman was Janna Cassian. According to people close to Janna, Blake told her that his marriage was already over. He said he was in the process of divorcing his wife. For Janna, who had come to America hoping to build a family, the relationship felt like the beginning of something real. Her mother, Olga, later said Janna believed Blake was the man she would marry, the man she would raise children with. And soon, another life-changing event followed. Janna became pregnant. In 2016, she gave birth to a baby girl named Diana. The child was born on Olga's birthday, a moment that the family saw as a sign of happiness and hope. Olga traveled from Ukraine to Los Angeles to help her daughter with the newborn. For those first days, the picture looked almost perfect. Blake, Janna, and their baby daughter together. Photos from that time show Blake smiling, holding the child, kissing Janna. According to Olga, he even used Russian words of affection with her daughter, calling her "my beloved." But that image of a happy family was fragile, because behind the scenes, Blake's life was far more chaotic than Janna realized. At the same time, he was living with Janna and their newborn daughter. Blake was also involved with another woman. Her name was Constance Bourgeois, and she lived in a house, also owned by Blake, only a few miles away. One life with Janna and the baby, another life with Constance, and a complicated, unfinished divorce with his wife Amanda. Investigators would later describe his situation as an unwieldy love quadrangle. 3 women, 1 man, and a situation that was becoming impossible to control. Then, only days after the birth of his daughter, the situation escalated. Constance accused Blake of sexual assault. Police arrested him. He was taken to jail, and it was Janna, the woman who had just given birth to his child, who helped bail him out. That moment exposed the truth about Blake's relationships. Janna learned that Blake had been seeing another woman. For someone who had just become a mother and believed she was building a life with him, the discovery must have been devastating. But according to her mother, Janna was afraid of losing him. Olga later said that Blake had begun to control her daughter's life. He demanded sex even while she was recovering from a C-section. He threatened to leave her for other women if she refused. And in order to keep the relationship alive, Janna made a painful decision. Her newborn daughter would stay with Olga in a separate apartment. Blake had paid for the apartment. The idea was that Janna could focus entirely on her relationship with him. Looking back, it is one of the most heartbreaking details in this entire story. A young mother separating from her newborn child because she believed it might save her relationship. But instead, it placed her even more deeply under Blake's control. And only days later, everything would spiral into violence. By late May of 2016, the tension between Janna and Blake was becoming impossible to ignore. Janna had just given birth. She was exhausted, physically vulnerable, and emotionally overwhelmed. Instead of stability, she was discovering that the man she trusted was living multiple lives. At the same time, Blake's world seemed to be tightening around him. His divorce was unresolved. His relationship with Constance had turned into a legal problem. And now, Janna knew the truth. For someone who was used to controlling situations with money and influence, that loss of control may have been difficult to handle. On May 23, 2016, Janna spent the day with her mother, Olga. Security footage later showed them shopping together. It was an ordinary day. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. But Olga later said something changed during that outing. Janna began receiving text messages. They were from Blake. And Olga noticed that every time Janna read one of those messages, her expression shifted. She later described it as watching her daughter transform like a chameleon. Something in those messages was clearly affecting her. Eventually, Janna told her mother she was going to see Blake. It would be the last time Olga saw her daughter alive. The following day, Olga tried calling Janna. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. By the 6th call, a feeling of dread had begun to grow. Parents sometimes describe a strange instinct. A sense that something is wrong even before they know what it is. Olga later said that was exactly what she felt. She called the police. But the response was limited. Officers attempted to check the situation, yet they had no immediate legal grounds to force entry into the apartment. At that point, it looked like a domestic matter. No screams, no reports of violence, no clear evidence of a crime. From a legal standpoint, the police had to be careful. Still, Olga remained deeply uneasy. The next day, she returned to the apartment building herself. What happened next only increased her fear. Standing outside the building, she looked up toward the 3rd-floor apartment where Janna and Blake lived, and she saw someone standing at the window. She believed it was Blake. Desperate, Olga tried to get inside the building. Another resident eventually opened the gate, allowing her into the complex. She ran upstairs and began pounding on the door. She rang the doorbell again and again. No answer. She called the police once more. Officers arrived and attempted to contact Blake by phone. They left a voicemail asking him to respond. But Blake did not come to the door. After waiting for several hours without clear signs of distress inside the apartment, the officers eventually left. Looking back, this moment remains one of the most painful questions in the entire case. Could more have been done? From the outside, it is always easier to ask that question after we know what happened. Police officers must balance many factors: legal limits, privacy rights, and the lack of visible evidence. Still, it is difficult not to wonder whether a different decision might have changed the outcome. Olga certainly believes it could have. By Thursday morning, her fear had turned into desperation. For 2 days, she had not heard from her daughter. She returned to the apartment again and called the police repeatedly, pleading for help. This time, officers agreed to conduct a welfare check inside the unit, because Janna had recently given birth. They were concerned she might be experiencing a medical emergency. When deputies arrived, they approached the apartment cautiously. They knocked. They announced themselves. Sheriff's Department. No response. Finally, they obtained a key from the building management. But when they unlocked the door and attempted to push it open, they discovered something strange. The door would not fully open. A hotel-style security latch had been engaged from the inside. That meant someone was still inside the apartment. The decision was made to breach the door. Officers forced their way into the condo. Immediately, they noticed something wrong. The living room appeared disturbed, furniture slightly out of place, a sense of disorder. As they moved deeper into the apartment, the obstacles continued. The hallway door leading to the bedrooms had been locked and barricaded. Deputies had to remove the door from its hinges. Inside the guest bedroom, they saw the first clear sign of violence. Blood. Blood on the walls. Blood on the headboard. They called out again. Blake! Janna! Still no answer. Moving further down the hallway, officers reached the master bedroom. The door was also barricaded. A mattress had been pushed against it from the inside. As deputies forced their way through the doorway, a voice suddenly called out from the room. It was Blake. He shouted that Janna was not there. Eventually, after a friend arrived and convinced him to cooperate, Blake opened the door. He emerged wearing only boxer shorts. Detectives would later say his behavior was strangely calm, but what they discovered inside the bedroom would haunt the investigators who entered that scene. Janna Cassian was lying on the bed. Her body was covered up to the chin with a Mickey Mouse blanket. At first glance, she appeared almost peaceful, but when detectives lifted her head from the pillow, they saw the full extent of her injuries. The brutality was almost impossible to describe. Her scalp had been removed. Her body was extremely pale, not simply from death, but from something far more disturbing. Janna had died from exsanguination. In simple terms, she had been drained of blood. The pathologist later concluded that the process likely lasted between 6 and 8 hours. In other words, this had not been a quick act of violence. It had been prolonged. And investigators would soon discover that the crime scene itself had been carefully cleaned. Too carefully. At first glance, the apartment did not contain as much blood as detectives expected. But when forensic specialists used a chemical called Blue Star, a reagent similar to luminol, the truth appeared. Walls lit up. Floors lit up. Footprints appeared. Cleaning patterns became visible. The entire apartment glowed with hidden traces of blood. It became clear that someone had spent significant time trying to erase what had happened there. But they had not erased everything. Near the apartment's trash chute, investigators recovered multiple bags of evidence. Bedding, clothing, and towels soaked in blood. One item stood out, a bed skirt with a bloody handprint. The print was distinctive. Part of the pinky finger was missing. Blake Liebel was missing part of his right pinky finger. For investigators, that detail was impossible to ignore. At the same time, Blake himself showed signs of struggle. He had scratches on his face, bruises, and a bite mark on his arm. Evidence that Janna had fought for her life. Despite all of this, Blake denied any involvement in her death. He offered no explanation for what had happened. Instead, he made a single statement to detectives. Science will tell you who did this. And in many ways, science did. The forensic evidence increasingly pointed toward Blake himself. But investigators still struggled with one haunting question. Why? What could possibly drive someone to commit an act this brutal against a woman he had claimed to love? The answer might lie not only in Blake's relationships, but also in something he had been creating for years. A graphic novel. One that depicted a killer who drained his victims of blood. And disturbingly, it was called Syndrome. The investigation into Janna Cassian's death was already disturbing. The brutality of the crime scene, the evidence that the violence had lasted for hours, the desperate signs that Janna had fought for her life. But as detectives continued digging into Blake Liebel's background, they discovered something that made the case even more chilling. A graphic novel. For years, Blake had been working on a project called Syndrome. It was a dark story about a violent killer. The imagery inside the book was disturbing, even by the standards of graphic fiction. One image in particular stood out, a victim hanging upside down, blood draining from the body. When prosecutors later saw those drawings, they believed they had found something important. Not just a creative project, a blueprint. During the trial, prosecutor Beth Silverman argued that Blake had not simply committed murder. He had acted out of fantasy. The prosecution presented images from the graphic novel alongside forensic evidence from the crime scene. In both cases, there were striking similarities. Victims suspended or restrained, blood drained from the body, extreme violence that appeared almost ritualistic. According to the prosecution, this was not a sudden explosion of anger. This was a violent imagination that had finally crossed the line into reality. And during the hours in which Janna was dying, Blake continued to behave in ways that shocked investigators. Security footage showed food deliveries arriving at the apartment. While Janna was fighting for her life inside that bedroom, Blake had ordered food. For many people in the courtroom, that detail was almost impossible to process, because it suggested something deeply disturbing. Not panic, not fear, but a chilling sense of normality. As if the person responsible could step away from the violence long enough to eat, to continue moving through ordinary life, and then return to the crime. During the trial, Janna's mother Olga sat through every moment. She saw photographs that no parent should ever have to see, graphic images of what had been done to her daughter. Yet she insisted on being there. Later she explained why. Because someone who loved Janna needed to witness what she had endured. Someone needed to bear that pain with her. Blake's family was also present in the courtroom. His brother Cody attended the proceedings. But very few people who had known Blake earlier in his life were willing to speak publicly. Investigators tried to understand whether there had been warning signs. Was Blake violent as a child? Did anyone ever notice something disturbing in his behavior? But the answer from most people who knew him was the same. No. Nothing that clearly predicted what he would later do. That raised another unsettling possibility. Sometimes monstrous acts are not committed by people who have always seemed monstrous. Sometimes they are committed by individuals who appear normal, even privileged, until something inside them finally breaks. Or perhaps until something inside them finally reveals itself. Psychologists involved in the case emphasized that Blake was not legally insane. He understood the difference between right and wrong. He understood the consequences of his actions, which meant that the law considered him fully responsible. After several days of testimony, the defense presented its final argument. Blake's attorney attempted to raise reasonable doubt. He suggested that the graphic novel did not prove Blake's intentions. Writers and artists had contributed to the story. Ideas were exchanged. The project was collaborative. Creative fiction, the defense argued, should not be mistaken for evidence of real-world violence. But the prosecution returned to the central question: the evidence, the blood, the attempts to clean the apartment, the handprint, the injuries, the hours during which Janna had suffered, and finally the silence from Blake himself. After hearing both sides, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. It took them only 3 hours to reach a decision. Blake Liebel was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, Blake showed little visible emotion. But outside the courtroom, Olga collapsed into grief. She cried out her daughter's name, apologizing for not being able to save her. Even now, years later, one question continues to follow this case. Could Janna have survived if help had arrived sooner? When Olga first called police, when she begged officers to check the apartment, when she stood outside the building and tried to get someone to open the door. From the outside, it is impossible to know exactly what would have changed. Police officers operate within strict legal limits. Without clear evidence of a crime, forcing entry into someone's home can be extremely difficult. Still, it is hard not to wonder whether more might have been possible, whether a different decision, at a different moment, could have interrupted the nightmare unfolding inside that apartment. And that uncertainty has never fully disappeared. But there is another, even darker question that remains. How can a human being commit something like this while fully aware of what they are doing? Because in many crimes, people search for a simple explanation: madness, drugs, a moment of uncontrollable rage. In this case, none of those explanations fully apply. Blake Liebel was evaluated by mental health professionals. He was found competent. He knew what he was doing, which means the truth may be more disturbing. Sometimes cruelty is not the result of insanity. Sometimes it grows slowly, shaped by personality, childhood experiences, power, control, and fantasies that are allowed to exist for years without consequence. And when that darkness finally emerges, it can take a form that is almost impossible to understand. For me, the conclusion of this case feels unavoidable. Blake Liebel is guilty, not only in the eyes of the court, but in the moral sense as well. What happened to Janna Cassian was not an accident. It was not confusion. It was not a moment of panic. It was a deliberate act of extreme cruelty against a woman who trusted him and had just given birth to his child. And yet, the most unsettling realization may be this: the person who committed this crime was not a monster hiding outside society. He was a man who appeared educated, successful, creative. A man who could sit in a room, speak calmly, and explain his artistic ideas about fictional violence. While somewhere inside him, something far darker was waiting. And perhaps that is the most frightening part of this entire story. Not that cruelty exists, but that sometimes it can live inside a person who seems completely normal until the moment it no longer stays hidden.